Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Arthur Millick. I work at the Claremont Institute. I run the Washington, D.C. center called the Center for the American Way of Life. As you know, we are now we moved ourselves to an online format, partly so that so many more people can join, almost 200. Our goal tonight is to do a discussion of the real philosophic disagreements between ancients and moderns. And this panel, of course, is going to focus on the moderns' disagreement with the ancients. Look forward to, in the coming weeks, we will do a panel that captures the reverse, that is the critique of the ancients of the moderns. Now, everybody has a sense of what that critique is, but I think, in my view and the view of some of these panelists, is that this hasn't been fully developed. Namely, we all know that Strauss says that underneath Machiavelli's many arguments, there's an anti-theological ire. We also know about all of the arguments about what commerce will do, what liberal democracy will do, and what the natural rights teaching will assist in doing. But I think too little focus has been on the actual philosophic arguments that the ancients understood themselves to be making, that made them, in their own minds, superior to the ancients. The moderns had, that made them superior to the ancients. That is our goal tonight to discuss. Speaking first will be Michael Anton on Machiavelli. He is a lecturer at Hillsdale and a senior fellow at the Claremont Institute. Next will be Svetozar Minkov, who will be speaking on Bacon. He is a professor of philosophy at Roosevelt University. Next will be Paul Diduc, speaking also on Bacon. He is an assistant professor in the Herbst Program for Engineering, Ethics, and Society at the University of Colorado Boulder. And last will be Murray Bissett, speaking on Nietzsche. He is the vice president of education at the Common Sense Society. Each panelist will speak for about 12 minutes, and then we will have a back and forth with the audience. Now, the audience will see that at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. What you'll do is you will click on that and type your question in, and I will read them. Thank you very much. Michael Anton. You're muted.
I am unmuted. I will point out, first of all, the passage in which Strauss refers to anti-theological ire is somewhat ambiguous and can be parsed. It's in What is Political Philosophy, first of all, the essay, and can be parsed and read such as not to apply specifically to Machiavelli himself. We can go into that later if we want. He does not repeat the phrase or use anything like it in his book called Thoughts on Machiavelli, meaning his own thoughts on this one thinker, which leads one to wonder whether that is, in fact, Strauss's final judgment. My own journey in studying Machiavelli has been away, in a sense, from the, I now call orthodox Straussian view that there's a sharp break in Machiavelli stands as a kind of anti-ancient avenger, critic, almost enemy. I think the break was deliberately exaggerated by Strauss, and the commonalities Machiavelli has with the ancients are greater than reading Strauss carefully than reading Strauss superficially, I should say, would first lead one to believe. But since I was asked to speak about the differences, I'm going to do that. I just wanted to state that as a preface. In no particular order, Machiavelli's criticisms of the ancients are numerous, and they begin, I think, from a premise that the ancients were too fatalistic, that they overestimate the power of nature and chance, they underestimate the power of human beings in the face of nature and chance. And so they instill men who read them, who read philosophy, with a kind of resignation. There's not much we can do in this life. To use one of Machiavelli's own metaphors in the beginning of chapter 25 of The Prince, which is in a sense the place where he most pointedly states this critique, some men have held and do hold the opinion that things are so governed by God and by fortune that men have no remedy. And he says, I judge that about half or close to that, fortune, he says, leaving out God in the restatement, fortune leaves that for men to govern for themselves. In other words, ancient philosophy underestimated what human power, what human ingenuity could do in this world. And it led to human beings to kind of sit back and take whatever nature and chance and the gods, if one believes the gods existed, we're going to throw at them. And Machiavelli thinks that was both degrading for human beings, and it caused them or encouraged them to accept circumstances and difficulties and trials and tribulations and indignities and humiliations and so on that they otherwise shouldn't have accepted. Okay, so a related critique is Machiavelli thinks that the ancient emphasis, speaking specifically of ancient philosophy here, on theory as opposed to practice, was both cause and effect of that I was about to say misunderestimation, a great George W. Bushism, if anybody remembers the far off years between 2000 and roughly and 2008. Misunderestimation of the power of nature causes ancient philosophy to be primarily theoretical and not practical. Philosophy just seeks to sit back behind or above nature, the nature of things, and try to understand, but not intervene and do anything. Not take positive steps to improve the lot of man, or to fight off the worst aspects of nature, or to prevent catastrophe, but just understand why they happen and learn to accept them. I mean, two ways of putting the same thought, one sort of high-minded and the other a little bit aphoristic, or the kind of thing you'd find on a plaque on your grandmother's wall, like the Serenity Prayer, which actually was on my grandmother's wall. The high-minded one is, Socrates' statement in the Phaedo that philosophy is learning how to die, which one interpretation is it's simply learning to accept that it's inevitable. There's nothing you can do about it. It's a natural part of the process, not gnashing your teeth about inevitable death, not being afraid of it, not trying to fight it, but just learning how to die, learning how to accept it. The other way to put it, we've all heard the phrase, well, he took that philosophically, by which is meant you tell someone a piece of bad news and they go, well, that's the way it goes. That's the way the cookie crumbles. Instead of getting angry, instead of gnashing their teeth, instead of going through if I recall correctly, the 5 stages of grief, aren't there 5 as I remember? They just immediately go to the end, acceptance. They've taken it philosophically. Machiavelli, I think, thinks the ancient teaching, the ancient emphasis on theory encourages people to take things philosophically in a way that's needlessly counterproductive. And he would like philosophy to get its hands dirty and to solve problems. There's a scene that I come back to often in Plutarch's Life of Marcellus. So Marcellus was the Roman general who conquered through siege the Greek colony city of Syracuse in the Second Punic War. And a famous resident of Syracuse was Archimedes, the guy from whom we get Archimedes' principle, how to measure the volume of an irregular shape, right? Famously learned by him by sitting in the bathtub and displacing a volume of water, and then he knows the volume of his own body, even though it's an irregular shape and is not otherwise easy to measure. And he utters the famous phrase "Eureka" when he discovers this or figures it out. I have found it. Well, as the siege was going on, Archimedes was drawing things and doing his theoretical projects, and the king of Syracuse, or tyrant, depending on how you may, another Machiavellian character, Jairo of Syracuse, not the Jairo of Xenophon's Jairo, a later Jairo, the same Jairo of chapter 6 of the Prince, comes to him and says, Archimedes, we're surrounded by a Roman army, and they're besieging us, and the city's going to fall, and here you are dueling and drawing geometric shapes and enjoying your theoretical pursuits, but you could put that brain of yours to work for your native city. And Archimedes hesitates, and at first he resists and says, I can't do this. And he cites Plato. Plato says we should not apply philosophy to these sorts of real world problems that corrupts the pure theory of the business. And Jairo, being a somewhat mild tyrant, I suppose, doesn't say, I'm just going to cut your head off if you do this for me, but attempts further persuasion, at which Archimedes relents, starts trying to build engines to counter the siege of the Romans. The story, unfortunately, ends unhappily. Marcellus takes the city, but commands a soldier, the one person I want you to find is this Archimedes and bring him to me. He's renowned, don't do anything bad to him. But some centurion not paying attention is walking through the city, and Archimedes is there drawing in the ground drawing geometric shapes with a stick in the dirt, and he gets in the soldier's way, and the soldier gets angry and cuts his throat. So, there you go. That's what ancient fatalism gets you, I suppose. So Machiavelli was against all that. He was against what he thought was the ancient teaching on justice. He thought led to over mildness. That is the ancient philosophic teaching, that the attempt to ascend the nomos, or the laws of the city, what they actually say, to find a justice founded in nature, leads to a critique of the laws of the city, or really of any city, that in the final presentation, in Machiavelli's view, say in Plato's Republic, this is what he means by the, one of the things he means by the famous denunciation in Prince 15 of imagined republics that have never been seen or known to exist in truth. That they come up with a theory of justice that sounds great on paper, but that when applied in the real world, ends disastrously, because it just opens wide holes for bad men to plow through and exploit. It's not hard-headed enough, this notion of eternal or perfect justice that the ancient philosophers lay out and try to promulgate. And that relates, in a sense, to his theoretical critique, because he says, to the extent that the ancient philosophers get involved in politics, they sort of seek the minimum. That is to say, they won't get directly involved, or when they do, it ends disastrously because they don't know what they're doing. And he rather maliciously and humorously cites Plato and two of Plato's students' involvement in Syracuse, the same city, in book 3, chapter 6 of the Discourses on Conspiracies, where his sole reference to Plato in all of his works is this idiot who taught two failed conspirators who got executed. That's it. 35 dialogues, forget it. Doesn't mention them, doesn't care. He's just a failure as a teacher of politics. That's it. In part because he was too abstract, and what he taught was too mild. So to the extent that the ancients, in Machiavelli's judgment, try to get involved, they try to get involved from the margins, and all they're trying to do is very cautious mitigation of some of the worst aspects of ancient practice. Sand a little bit of the rough edges off here, a little there, and the means that they try to do it are, in Machiavelli's view, essentially ineffectual. So they do it two ways, roughly speaking. They try to cozy up to the noble youth, right? They try to win over people who are going to become prominent in the assembly, and figure, I got my eye on you at age whatever, you're going to be prominent someday. I will get my hooks into you and teach you to be a better ruler, so that when you eventually rule, you'll end up being a milder ruler. Now, this opens up a whole nother avenue for discussion, which we can't go into at the moment, but which is to say, to what extent are the philosophers trying to capture the noble youth in order to turn them entirely away from politics and toward philosophy? Another one of Machiavelli's critiques. But to the extent that they try to counsel some to go into politics, they have very modest ambitions for what they try to tell them to do, and it's ineffectual. And the other way they try to influence politics is to write books. And Machiavelli considers their books to have been, at best, ineffectual, unlike his books, which he thinks are going to be very effectual, to borrow another word that he uses, again, in Prince 15, or harmful. And that sort of ties us right back to the beginning. So his deepest critique is that the ancient philosophic teaching of the good, of natural right, of a transcendent truth that is bigger and greater than the truth of any city, that transcends time and place, right? It leads to a kind of, it's well suited perhaps to a certain cast of mind, aka the philosophic cast of mind, but it is ill suited to the masses, for which it was not intended. And the ancients utterly failed to anticipate this doctrine's capture by a popular religion that would, in a sense, dumb it down to the common denominator, spread it throughout the world, and implement the worst aspects of the ancient teaching that were not meant for nor applicable to, and in fact are outright deleterious to human practice. And to him, the ancient failure to anticipate that this might happen, failure in a way to sew up and bulletproof their doctrine, or the way Strauss puts it metaphorically, their emphasis on domestic policy and their complete neglect of foreign policy and the imperatives of defense and of fighting fire with fire when facing a new enemy with a weapon that you didn't anticipate that you don't have, leads to the conquest of the ancient world and the conquest of ancient philosophy by a hostile doctrine. And his view is that failure is catastrophic and ultimately must be laid at the feet of the ancient philosophers for at least two reasons. One is their doctrine welcomed it and facilitated it. And two is, as wise as they thought they were, they didn't see it coming and were utterly blindsided by it. So I think that's my 12 minutes, and I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Michael Anton. Svetozar Minkov.
Yeah, okay. There's a great 12 minutes, and I wish I could just discuss this right away, but I'll just try to identify Bacon's critique of a philosophical position, something about forms in the ancients, meaning Plato and Aristotle, because he's very favorable to Democritus and others. It's actually difficult to do that because Bacon wasn't a Straussian, so he didn't present a commentary on Aristotle's physics or metaphysics or something like that. So you have to extract it from certain obiter dicta, or to think about how to extract that critique. And there seems to be a critique because of these dicta. He's a little better in that regard than Descartes, who merely mocks evasively Aristotle's definition of motion, though in a sense worse than Descartes because doesn't get that granular. So I think there's several ways to do it. I'm just going to focus on two passages in Bacon. I wrote a kind of paper on Bacon's dialectics, or Bacon on dialectics, in the Novum Organum. But the Novum Organum requires more of a wind-up, and so the two passages I'm going to focus on are in the Advancement of Learning and the Principles and Origins, unpublished manuscript by Bacon, where he just jumps into his critique of Democritus, but mostly praise of Democritus, and then critique of Plato and Aristotle. And the Advancement of Learning is a little clearer in its structure, I'd say. So anyway, let's see if I can specify that critique, the Baconian critique of Plato and Aristotle. So firstly, the Proficiency and Advancement of Learning, that's 1605. Book one is a defense of learning, and book against various criticism, political or religious criticisms. Book two is taking of stock of where learning is deficient, and it begins with history, and then poetry, and then it gets to knowledge. And there are difficulties here too. I think Principles and Origins is clearer, but the difficulty here is that history, the history of nature, falls under history, and in the second book of the New Organon, Novum Organon, Bacon says that his history is the measure of the universe. So anyway, we kind of have to skip through that part, that history could have a greater significance for physics and study of nature. History, then there's poetry, poesy, and then you have knowledge, and you have divine knowledge, followed by knowledge of nature, followed by human knowledge, which itself is an interesting sequence. Okay, so the confrontation with Aristotle and Plato on nature happens in the section on knowledge of nature. knowledge of nature falls into three parts: physics, metaphysics, and mathematics. And it's in the advancement of learning, 1605, physics is treated, the current state of physics is treated very summarily, extremely so, and is declared somewhat disingenuously, perhaps, non-deficient, non-defective. The case is very different in the 1623 expansion, Latin expansion of the advancement of learning, which was partly prompted by Galileo's discoveries in 1610 of various moons of Jupiter and so on. So there's a very long discussion of astronomy in this section on physics. So Bacon thought physics wasn't deficient, and Galileo discovers a number of things which really transform physics. So he responds accordingly in the Latin translation of the advancement of learning. Mathematics is the last one. I'm not going to say much about mathematics. And mathematics for Bacon is like tennis. It's, as he says, it's good for quickness of eye or agility of body. Incidentally or interveniently, as he says, it's not good in itself. So it can help. It's instrumental. So the critique of Aristotle and Plato occurs in the section on metaphysics, and it concerns forms. So, and I mean, I just want to present it, and you can read it for yourselves, but I'll present it seriously as I see it. So the problem that Bacon addresses first there is that there's a kind of inveterate opinion that forms are not accessible. It's kind of the opposite of this, maybe the Straussian reading, I'm not sure. And they're beyond human knowledge. But then he says, but what's good about this inveterate but wrong opinion is that it presupposes that it's important to look for forms, that the forms are the true object of knowledge. Now, that's there, that somewhere else he says forms mean something else, laws of action, but you're looking for the true lineaments of nature. The only problem in this search for forms is that people are looking for forms of the wrong thing. They're looking for forms of the thing that strike your eye immediately, such as trees and oranges and, I don't know, bananas, human beings, and so on. And it says it actually, that kind of makes sense in the case of human beings. You should look for the form. But in all other cases, it's much more perplexed and complicated. The alphabet of natures and qualities is different from what initially strikes the eye. So it's not, and even the point about human beings, I think, is contradicted too powerfully by other works of Bacon. For example, in the Wisdom of the Ancients, in the great Prometheus fable, he says, it's precisely the human being that's the most perplexed and compounded being. So there's actually no idea or form of the human being. So then he points to the alphabet of natures and qualities, and actually the examples he gives are rather limited: forms of sense, voluntary motion, vegetation, colors, and then three dualities or pairs: gravity, levity, density, tenuity, and heat, cold. So that's form. So there are forms, but they're not the forms you expect. And you shouldn't go along with the common sense. I know Dr. Bassett is part of the Common Sense Society, so he'll something to say. The common sense perception of forms. And quickly about final causes. Maybe I'll say something about principles of origins, but maybe later. Final causes, and he gives 6 examples. Bacon, for example, clouds give rain. The leaves protect the fruit. None of the examples he gives are anthropocentric, so they're also happen to be helpful to human beings. There, the critique of Aristotle and Plato is that it is true that the nature as it presents itself is helpful to certain human beings, but if you are overly impressed by that, this may be related to Michael Anton's presentation, then you're not going to study the physical counterpart to these causes, the final causes. So he doesn't deny the existence of, I mean, it's very difficult, of course, he probably doesn't mean it, but he doesn't deny the existence of teleology at that point, except if you become so complacent about natural purpose and natural cause that you don't study nature. And there, I think that there's a real, in that section, there's a real theoretical difficulty, because he praises Democritus, whose understanding of atoms can give an account of the world, kind of infinite repetition of the same processes eventually will generate our world. This is kind of a brilliant interpretation of the castration of Kronos in Hesiod, and maybe it's before in Bacon, that means that the world's frame is limited. So there's no more generation, no more world or universe is being created. And within a limited universe, there will be a lot of bouncing around, like a dryer, and there'll be a eternal recurrence of the same or something of that sort. Yeah, so he does say that, but I just want to point to, it's more of a problem about Democritus here, because he in the same passage he says Democritus provides this interpretation of how the world comes about, and there's not always a cosmos, but there's something deeper than the cosmos. These blind, naked atoms, and we happen to live in a period when there's a cosmos, but that's not the intention, and it's perfectly explicable through this repetition. Yeah. But at the end of this same section, still within the advancement of learning, it's still chapter 7 of book 2, maybe chapter 8. He says, physical causes do not withdraw men's minds from God and providence, because, and this is, maybe you can point to the essay of atheism here, it's far less likely that these random blind atoms will produce a world than the four elements let's see, then something like Aristotle's four causes. Let's say. So I think, but that could be explicable rhetorically. But it's a real question, because Democritus is Bacon's model throughout his writings. The only one formulation will be, the only thing you need to do is to make Democritus more severe, more sober, and more precise. Yeah. So so I think I don't have time for, but I just want to flag this for an interpretation of principles or presentation of principles and origins. But there he gives an account of the root cause of the Platonic Aristotelian error, as against the Democritus's correct opinion about the generation of the world. Let me stop here.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Minkov. Professor Diduk.
Can you hear me okay, Arthur?
Yes.
All right. So I'm going to move over to Bacon's practical philosophy, now that we've heard a word or two about the theoretical philosophy. I know that Arthur wants us to talk about the modern's critique of the ancients, but I think in the case of Bacon, and especially his advocacy for technological science, I think I can more effectively highlight his critical departures from ancient thought by starting first with his agreements with it. That is, I believe we can better appreciate the radicalness of Bacon's vision for scientific society by first seeing that Bacon more or less agrees with Plato and Aristotle on the dangers of technological innovation. Now, I think starting from this point helps us also to consider at least two additional Baconian matters that are of some importance for us today. First, Bacon's agreement with the ancients forces us to concede that he was in no way naively optimistic about the benefits of technological growth, nor is he hopeful about any sort of automatic confluence between scientific and moral progress. I would say, to the contrary, Bacon seems to think that technological science can only be safely pursued under rather narrow and even illiberal conditions. Second, by acquainting ourselves with precisely these, his ideal conditions, as he lays them out in New Atlantis, we can begin to more effectively consider the successes, compromises, and trade-offs of our own scientific societies, especially given the fact that most Western nations have taken on something like Bacon's scientific project, while also eschewing his recommended safeguards. So let me start first with a word on the ancients. Like Neil Postman, I think that the most helpful place to start on Plato's concerns about technology is with the Phaedrus, specifically Socrates' myth of Thuth and Thamos. According to the myth, Thuth, the demon who first discovers number and the arithmetical arts, he approaches Thamos, the king of Egypt, with some of his latest creations. As an inventor, Thuth is very enthusiastic about his novel devices, and he expects Thamos to share in his excitement. Thamos, however, is rather immune to the allure of novelty, believing, as he does, that technical devices tend to purchase their good effects at some, often hidden cost. Thamos therefore proceeds to consider critically each of Thuth's inventions on its own terms, including the seemingly good or obviously good technique of writing. Thamos accepts or rejects Thoth's offerings based on their psychological and political effects. And because it is nigh impossible to predict the downstream or ecological consequences of any innovation, he is especially conservative about admitting anything into Egypt that can't be folded into its way of life. So the point I want to stress is that when it comes to technological innovation, it is the regime and not the scientist, not the inventor, certainly not the merchant or the consumer, that ought to exercise gatekeeping powers over what enters into the life of the city. Plato echoes this notion in Republic and Laws. Aristotle articulates his own version in the second book of the Politics, where he criticizes the flamboyant and optimistic Hippodamus for his somewhat naive assumptions about a putatively natural or rational society that can, as a function of its liberation from tradition, somehow promote and absorb innovation. Like Plato, Aristotle rejects the not unreasonable promises of progress in favor of regime stability. In this case, it is the preservation of the psychological or the habitual substrate. For our purposes, we can call their basic position, sort of following Strauss, we can call this ancient technological conservatism, a position they articulate, promote, and defend with their arguments, but also by marshaling pre-existing prejudices that helped or that held the applied sciences in very low esteem, right? The applied sciences are banausic or vulgar. Now, I want to argue that Bacon accepts as true or right the worries that stand behind ancient technological conservatism. What he rejects, however, is that these worries necessarily preclude the political support of technological science. To see evidence of Bacon's agreement with technological conservatism, we turn to his retelling of the myth of Daedalus in the Wisdom of the Ancients. Here, Bacon's depiction and interpretation of Daedalus mirrors the concerns raised by Plato's myth of Thoth and Thamos. There are two problems, however, that Bacon brings into even sharper relief than the ancients, and which I think evince the acuity of his concerns. The first is the political and moral challenge posed by the rogue or the mercenary scientist, the Daedalus type, who is willing to hire out his talents to anyone on the right terms. Bacon is very clear that once the science gets loose, it will be extremely difficult, impossible in some cases, to fully control how discoveries and information are trafficked. Part of the problem is that the very types who are likely to be most inclined to experiment and innovate, they're also unlikely to be voluntarily restrained by law and custom. The Daedalus type, therefore, will be willing to work for any court or regime and do mostly anything for a price. Daedalus is, of course, notorious for crafting the machinery that enables Pasiphae, the queen of Minos, to satisfy her unnatural lust for the bull. The unforeseen and monstrous consequence of their union, the Minotaur, is how Bacon pictures the second major problem of unfettered science. Here, Bacon is very clear that unless scientific innovations are governed or constrained by regime, experimental science may generate effects which require further technological commitment to contain the problem, and these in turn may generate downstream effects which require more technology, and so on and so forth in a cascade effect. For Bacon, both of these challenges, the Daedalus problem and the Minotaur problem, must be taken seriously for reasons that reflect ancient worries about social and political stability. Given this agreement, then, Bacon thus compels us to wonder how it is that he intends to prevent or minimize the risks his own project carries for European politics. I want to argue that it is precisely this question, or we could say the light of this problem, that best prepares us to appreciate some of the odd features of Bacon's New Atlantis, where he pictures for us the ideal conditions of the scientific society, including the political innovations necessary for its safest cultivation. I'll note a handful of the salient features. Hopefully I get through this before my time winds up. The first and most obvious provision for the safe cultivation of science in Ben Salem is that its only scientific institution, Solomon's House, conducts its researches both in secret and behind a religious facade. While the public knows that Solomon's House is committed to scientific investigation, it believes that this mission is consistent with its version of biblical religion and in no way threatens its theology or its morality. Solomon's House takes this aspect of its public persona very seriously. Its scientists dress and act like a holy brotherhood, and they conduct public rituals and present the dispensing of technologies as acts of piety and religious charity. Bacon's presentation of the fusion of science and religion in Ben Salem is thus apt to strike us as quaint or foolish or utterly misbegotten. We in the secular West tend to believe that science can persist and prosper without religion. In fact, many believe we are much better off precisely because religion has, under the influence of science, faded in its significance. Bacon does not or would not support this development. His position, rather, is that science will function best if it can work within and exert influence over a civil religion. As we see in Ben Salem, religion is the best means for scientific and governmental offices to repurpose and stabilize customs that are necessary for political life, but have themselves grown beyond their roots and necessity. This is especially true in the domain of the family and sexual morality. In addition, religion helps the regime govern its scientific hierarchy by applying the pressure, if not of inward assent, then at least public conformity. The powers of Solomon's House extend beyond religion into politics and economy, with each sector of Ben Salem's essential interests being somehow governed or at least supervised by its officers. While Ben Salem is nominally a monarchy, the king is mostly absent from Bacon's narrative and seems to have been reduced to a kind of symbolic figurehead. This aspect of Bacon's scientific regime is perhaps one of its most radical innovations. Not only is Bacon suggesting that the political realm ought to be subordinate to the supervision of scientific experts, but Ben Salem also actively eclipses the virtues associated with its most venerable king, Alteben. Bacon seems to be suggesting that for the scientific society to be stable, not only must the purview of the political sphere be constrained by expertise, but the traditional masculine virtues, the profile of the so-called sons of pride, needs to be subordinate to the sons of peace. The radicalness of this indication is set off by recalling the moderate aims of ancient thought, right? Think back to what Professor Anton was saying. While Plato and Aristotle might have sought to engage a gentlemanly class friendly to intellectual culture, they would in no way endeavor to advance the direct authority of a priestly philosophic elite. Here, Bacon's picture of Ben Salem departs from the classics, and I would argue has its roots more in the traditions of Christendom. But instead of the church hierarchy lording its moral authority over sovereign nations, Bacon suggests that the new scientific class can become a different type of priesthood, the main difference being that they will be armed with his active science and can thus traffic more effectively with political power to align themselves against their spiritual enemies. In this way, Bacon takes advantage of the legacy of Christianity as a decisive improvement of the New Atlantis over its ancient counterpart, including in its eugenic effects. While Bacon agrees with Plato that old Atlantis was hurt by its imperial hubris, the New Atlantis can shape the legacy of Christian morality to provide for a sure form of political stability. A less masculine, more Christian, more tolerant, more charitable technological empire promises much greater civilizational longevity than anything we inherit from the archaic or classical worlds. Bacon's presentation of Ben Salem indicates, however, that it is not sufficient for the scientific community to simply cloak its activities behind a civil religion. The regime must actively calibrate the levels of its material comforts and technological disclosure to support its customs and morality. The citizens of Ben Salem not only do not see their lives or the life of their nation through the lens of science or industry, let alone some notion of scientific cosmopolitanism. They have no expectation of progress in research or development. They don't even understand, let alone have access to, the full range of their regime's technological capacity. To put this differently, there are no laser guns, smartphones, or flying cars, at least not publicly in Ben Salem, and there's no expectation that there should be. What dictates the horizon of material comfort is what the regime decides is most compatible with its stability, not any need to generate economic growth or answer to consumer demands. With no economic or ideological need to promise a greater technological future to its citizens, Ben Salem can keep developing its powers in secret and trickle out innovations according to its own planning and schedule. Let me note finally that Bacon is quite clear that the Western powers will not be able to recreate or emulate fully the model of Ben Salem. And I'm not sure or certain Bacon think it would be wise to try or even desirable if possible. We can assume then, I think, that Bacon understands that the future of scientific Europe and its dominion is going to be a mix of intentional influence and happenstance. But this in itself is enough to indicate that Bacon, as a champion of, let's say, an uncertain technological project that is not yet safely in the custody of an institution or regime or religion, Bacon's making a considerable bet on a promise that is fraught with risk. His willingness to make this move, however justifiable, is perhaps one of the clearest indications of his departure from the ancients. And though, as we've seen, Bacon attempts to build into his vision some version of ancient restraint, it seems to me that the ancients would nonetheless regard his project, or at least its technological dimension, as wishful and immoderate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Bassett, please.
Thank you, Arthur. Now, Arthur has asked that we panelists not do as all too many scholars do, rush headlong into the moral and political, but instead linger with and elaborate the philosophical, which I took to mean metaphysical, grounds of our author's critique of the ancients. But as Heidegger has remarked, all metaphysics is moral, so the destination is apparently preordained. Over the next 12 minutes or so, relying primarily on Twilight of the Idols, I will attempt to clearly and succinctly lay out two interrelated and intertwined arguments that run through Nietzsche's philosophy that distinguish him both from the ancients and the moderns, whom he sees as in fundamental continuity with them. The primary argument, from which the secondary argument is derived, deals with the problem of error in appearance, that is, the relationship of being and becoming, art and truth, reality and appearance. The secondary argument deals with morality and immorality and necessarily follows from the first, because the underlying mechanism that accounts for the development of each is identical, overcoming transformation. Both arguments ultimately manifest and bear witness to the fact that life is always enhancement of life. Life for Nietzsche is embodied, is corporeal. Human beings do not possess bodies, rather we exist bodily. That is, we exist as a physio-psychological being that finds itself with itself and at the same time with beings that are not ourselves. Embodied life thus is always lifted beyond itself and into the world outside of it. Embodied life in general then is inherently and inevitably relational, which, as Nietzsche mentions in the preface to Beyond Good and Evil, makes the perspectival the basic condition of all life. From its perspective, or within its network of relations, each being draws a horizon. When it encounters another being within its horizon, one perspective out of many possible perspectives is petrified and fixed as the definitive appearance of the thing. Perceived perspectively, that which is fixed and constant is mere appearance, not the true or the real or being. The surroundings that embodied beings encounter as fixed and constant, therefore, are always apparent or erroneous, because they are only one facet of a multifaceted world. But how does man make identical, constant, and ascertainable what he encounters? Does he impose this identity without reference to the actual relations and facets of the thing in question? Or does he impose as determinative one of the actual relations and facets of the thing? Nietzsche answers the latter. However, does it not matter which of the actual relations and facets are fixed, at least insofar as one can distinguish between essential and trivial relations and facets? In other words, are not some perspectives better than others? Nietzsche indicates as much in Twilight of the Idols when he says, quote, out of this feeling of rapture, one lends to things, one forces them to accept from us, one violates them. This process is called idealizing. Let us get rid of a prejudice here. Idealizing does not consist, as is commonly held, in subtracting or discounting the petty and inconsequential. What is decisive is rather a tremendous drive to bring out the main features so that the others disappear in the process, end quote. The process of idealizing is an artistic one, and while it, like man's logic, imposes upon things, it does not disregard or discount the other features. As such, what it shows is truer or more just to life. Idealizing clarifies by heightening the main features of the thing in question. In fixing the main features of the thing, it brings the thing out of becoming and into being. Furthermore, the petty or inconsequential features disappear in the light of this clarity. That is, while still present, they are not seen because the greater light of the heightened features drowns out their own. But perhaps the most important aspect of art is that in idealizing, it opens up higher ground, which in turn enables a higher perspective, one that was not possible previously. Here we see the relationship of art and truth, and why it is that for Nietzsche, art is worth more than truth. For art, or for truth to be worth less than art, does not imply that it is worthless. Rather, truth as making fixed and constant, that is understood perspectively, is necessary to life, despite the fact that in petrifying life, it inhibits and dissolves life. In allowing life to rest firmly on a particular perspective and to preserve itself, truth provides that which art transfigures through idealization. If life is always enhancement of life, then art as transfiguration is more enhancing to life than truth, as fixation of an apparition. As I will argue momentarily, so too is morality, or rather immorality, a form of transfiguring life to higher possibilities. In addressing the topic of morality in Twilight of the Idols, Nietzsche reduces a principle to a formula. Quote, every naturalism in morality, that is every healthy morality, is dominated by an instinct of life. Some commandment of life is fulfilled by a determinate canon of shalt and shalt not. Some inhibition and hostile element on the path of life is thus removed, end quote. By identifying healthy moralities as natural moralities, Nietzsche indicates that harmony with life, understood as enhancement, serves as the standard. He continues, anti-natural morality, that is almost every morality which has so far been taught, revered, and preached, conversely, turns against the instincts of life. It is the condemnation of these instincts. The relationship between these two moralities is the following. The natural moralities of one day are the anti-natural moralities of the next. Morality, says Nietzsche, insofar as it condemns for its own sake, and not out of a regard for the concerns, considerations, and contrivances of life, is a specific error with which one ought to have no pity. An idiosyncrasy of degenerates, which has caused immeasurable harm, end quote. The use of the word error to describe anti-natural morality more explicitly draws the parallel between morality and truth. Quote, all priests and moralists have wanted to take mankind back, to screw it back to a former measure of virtue. Morality was always a bed of Procrustes, end quote. Anti-natural morality seeks to preserve and perpetuate its measure of virtue, not because it is beneficial, but because it is held to be so. In seeking to perpetuate this measure of virtue over against the measure that is then healthy, it necessarily cuts off the enhancing aspects of life. It says no to both the lowest and the highest desires of life, from sex to rule. Here we see what it means to be an immoralist, to stand outside the distinctions that sustain and perpetuate an anti-natural measure of virtue. The immoralist, in other words, stands with natural morality over against anti-natural morality. Insofar as nearly every morality has been an anti-natural morality, this stand against anti-natural morality is taken as a stand against morality simply. Furthermore, since natural morality seeks to preserve and perpetuate a different measure of virtue than that then held to be virtue, it is necessarily immoral from the perspective of the governing anti-natural morality. The foregoing notwithstanding, since this natural morality necessarily will become anti-natural as human nature changes, the immoralist must be prepared to stand against it and in favor of the next natural morality, lest he become or degenerate into a moralist. This reveals that the immoralist does not stand with natural morality, but rather stands with life, the enhancement of which is the end to which morality, whether natural or anti-natural, is a means. Anti-natural morality, then, as the attempt to preserve and perpetuate a measure of virtue that impedes and stifles life, can be said to be a revolt against life. In light of this, one might expect the immoralist who both comprehends the futility, apparentness, absurdity, and mendaciousness of such a revolt, and stands with life, to condemn anti-natural morality without qualification. Nietzsche, thus, must explain why this is not the case. The condemnation of life expressed in anti-natural morality is an evaluation of life, and as such, it remains in the end a mere symptom of a certain kind of life, that is, of declining, weakened, weary, condemned life. Life understood as enhancement necessarily is evaluative or value-laden. Quote, when we speak of values, says Nietzsche, we speak with the inspiration, with the way of looking at things, which is a part of life. Life itself forces us to posit values. Life itself values through us when we posit values, end quote. Even anti-natural morality then is an expression of life. To condemn it is to condemn life. The immoralist, however, not only does not condemn, rather, he affirms. Pardon the extended quote here, but I do think that it's rather important. We others, we immoralists, have conversely made room in our hearts for every kind of understanding, comprehending, and approving. We do not easily negate. We make it a point of honor to be affirmers. More and more our eyes have opened to that economy which needs and knows how to utilize everything that the wholly witless priest, the diseased reason of the priest, rejects. That economy in the law of life which finds an advantage even in the disgusting species of the prigs, the priests, the virtuous. What advantage? We ourselves, we immoralists, are the answer. One can finish after his ellipsis here with, they are that which must be overcome. To the foregoing, the moralist might ask, but what of virtue? Do you, you immoralist, desire men to be vicious? And if not, what is virtue to you? To which the immoralist replies that he cares not for virtue, he cares only for health. The moralist's questions naively presuppose that a fixed and universal measure of virtue is available and need only be discovered and applied. The immoralist's reply, conversely, asserts that the questions posed miss the mark. It's not a question of discovering and applying a measure of virtue, but of accepting that reality shows us an enchanting wealth of types, the abundance of a lavish play and change of forms, and of seeking to enable each to become what it is. Consider the subtitle, the Ecce Homo, how one becomes what one is. The problem is reason's prejudice, in other words, reason's piety. The problem is precisely that which is presupposed in the moralist question, that God or the good or virtue is something fixed and permanent. The problem is a misunderstanding of the foundation of the virtues. They are not rooted outside of, but rather are rooted in the concrete individual, in the health of each individual, and the actualization of the order immanent in each individual, which is to say, the virtues are not subjective and suggestive, but objective and prescriptive, while at the same time relative. One could say that the ethical imperative is to become what one is. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of our presenters. First of all, before we get to the audience's questions, of which there are a handful, would anybody like to respond to any of the other panelists? Or make comment, or an addition? Okay. In that case,
So,
yeah.
sorry, I was mute. I just wanted to. I just misunderstood what Michael Anton said. I just wanted to make it clear that the ancients thought, and of course, ancients, not but of course, but in the case of Bacon, there's no such thing as the ancients, even though he talks about the old. Because Democritus is radically different from Plato and Aristotle. So maybe we mean Plato and Aristotle. But anyway, Plato and Aristotle thought that nature was too weak or too strong. I just didn't.
No, I think Machiavelli thinks ancient philosophy overestimated the power of nature relative to mankind, that nature and fortune, in his judgment, they thought, so I have to qualify this two ways. This is his judgment, this is his account of their thinking, right? Yeah. That they believe nature and fortune were so powerful that man really didn't have much recourse against this combination of nature and fortune. And so he shouldn't exert himself too much, and should, to the extent that he wants to interact with nature, he ought to think about it and examine it rather than try to manipulate it.
Good. Okay. So that applies to Democritus and Plato in equal measure.
Yeah, I mean, Machiavelli never makes it. First of all, he never mentions Socrates ever. He mentions Plato and Aristotle once each, both to insult them and to sort of pretend like the magnitude of their actual achievements just didn't happen. The only real distinction he makes amongst the ancients are between historians and philosophers. He's down on the philosophers for the most time, and he's up on the historians. But even his praise of the historians is guarded or qualified in that he doesn't think much of the historians themselves. He thinks that they provide useful matter for a new kind of thinker to mine and examine and use those lessons for practical application. The one exception, whom he recommends reading is twice at the end of Prince 14 and cites several times in the discourses and elsewhere, is Xenophon, who he seems to admire, but in a way as a historian who provides useful lessons that you can learn things from in the application in the real world. And this is not a observation new to me. Strauss makes this point, that he never mentions any of Xenophon's Socratic writings. He won't even mention, which would be it's very telling that he never mentions the Anabasis. I don't know how to pronounce it in Greek, sorry. Is it Anabasis? Whatever. He never mentions. It's
probably the same English.
Even though that book is a gold mine of Machiavelli type lessons. My supposition, which I don't think Strauss ever mentions, but my supposition is because Socrates appears in it one time. In book 3, he just pretends it didn't exist.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, please, Mr. Didou.
If anybody wants to respond to the Machiavelli question, go ahead. I have a question for Professor Minkoff, so I don't want to break the flow.
Go ahead, please.
Professor Minkoff, can you elaborate on your comment that for Bacon, Democritus is the model that he follows throughout? I think that's what you said.
Yes,
I'm just curious.
Please.
Let me finish. Can you say something about Democritus or Bacon's admiration for Democritus in the light of Kenneton's notion that Bacon, not a theoretical materialist, but something like a methodological materialist?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it's very obvious once you look at the new organon, and then this advancement of learning, and all. I mean, and any of his theoretical works, that Democritus is the model, and in fact, he says he is the model in Principles and Origins, which is an interesting work, which jumps right into things that he never finished. It's an elaboration of Wisdom of the Ancients. He says what you need is a Democritus. That's what Bacon says. You need a Democritus who is sober and more severe and more and more precise. And he said Democritus is an atomist. Yeah, so he does say that Democritus. The criticism of Democritus in the Novum Organum and in Principles and Origins. So he thinks of himself as the better Democritus.
Okay,
so there's many criticisms. Yeah.
So a Democritus that's more severe and precise is what? A Democritus with a method, or how do you understand that?
So for instance, he says up and down. Democritus thinks there's up and down motion. I mean, that might not be fair to Democritus. But there's many other kinds of heterogeneous motions. So it's not only method. Now, the more fundamental thing might be, I think it's somewhere. I mean, I can find it very quickly if people who know Novum Organum. It's in the fifth, where he talks about people who pay attention to the structure or the fabric or the composition of the universe, as opposed to the ingredients of the universe. And Democritus is the one who pays attention to the ultimate alphabet or ingredients of the universe, and he doesn't pay attention to the form or structure or composition or configuration of the universe. Now, but that's because, but he likes that because human beings tend to pay attention to the configuration. Maybe if Bacon was resurrected today, he would say there's not enough attention to the basic configuration of things or composition, and too much attention to something else. But yes, so that's interesting. Yes. So even though Bacon thought that Democritus erred in not paying enough attention to configuration, composition, form, fabrication in the sense of structure. That's all right, because human beings tend to think, oh, that's a male and a female. That's a this and a that. So these forms, these stereotypes that we say today. So Bacon is the first kind of gender theorist. Too many stereotypes, so you have to really break that up. And Democritus is very good. Now, they're ultimately, but I don't. He doesn't go along with gender theory in the sense that he thinks there's actually a genuine understanding of nature, and there's the alphabet of nature, and there's 12 different other things which you have to discover, and that's the truth about nature. And it's not what you like to be. So yeah, you don't have to be male or female, but you have to be X, and you can have a choice about that.
Thank you very much. This is to the whole panel. I'm reading a question. To what extent do these moderns believe that Plato and Aristotle held mistaken theoretical opinions about nature, and consequently mistaken understandings of what philosophy is or should be, as contrasted against the ecumenical possibility that the moderns simply disagree with the public presentation of philosophy adopted by the ancients, and accordingly adopted different measures for the needs of their own time? In short, can we so easily separate theoretical disagreements between ancients and moderns, if they exist, for their respective teachings about the proper relation of philosophy and the public? Any takers?
Can you restate the first part of that question? I got lost with the last sentence.
To what extent do these moderns believe that Plato and Aristotle held mistaken theoretical opinions about nature, and consequently mistaken understandings of what philosophy is or should be?
All right, I'll try that. I sort of hinted at this when I started. The older I get, the more I believe Machiavelli has almost no substantive disagreement about the nature of things with Plato and Aristotle. He has a tactical or strategic disagreement with their public presentation, which he thinks led to a disaster that they did not anticipate. So if they made a mistake, it was in not anticipating the disaster. And so that sort of takes away or walks back or undermines what I said at the beginning. That is to, I was trying to do what you wanted us to do, Arthur, which was draw those philosophical differences out. But I think the philosophical differences between Machiavelli and Plato and Aristotle on content are a lot smaller than they first appear, in that he greatly exaggerates his critique of them in his books, where he's like I say, he only actually mentions either one of them by name once each. But when he talks about ancient philosophy or ancient doctrines, he's usually pretty merciless. For instance, in the famous passage in Prince 17 about Scipio versus Hannibal, which is replicated in a much longer discussion in Discourses 3, 19 through 22, if I recall, maybe it's 23. Yeah, no, 19 through 23. Scipio sort of is meant to represent the humanistic or the humane ancient tradition. So in other words, not the theory, but the practice. And he seems to be saying that it wasn't that the ancients had it right, but the way they presented it, what too many people took from it was a kind of soft, humane doctrine of holding out an open hand and hoping for the best or assuming the best, which allows the wicked to trample on you. Whereas the real Aristotle and the real Plato are not quite that naive, but I think he thinks they wrote in such a way as to inspire naivete in people. And what's needed now as a corrective is his own teaching, which is deliberately presented as a lot harsher than he believes the truth is, but is needed to sort of, if what people have taken from the ancient teaching is a softness that is untrue to nature, what he needs now to get it back toward the middle is to deliver a harshness, which is also not true to nature. That's the only way we can get the truth and true practice somewhere in the center, grounded around what is actually correct and accurate.
Thank you. Next question. Returning for a moment. Yes, please.
Yeah, can I respond to that?
Yes.
I don't know. It seems to me that the questioner, I could be wrong, wants to probe the idea that what principally accounts for the differences between ancients and moderns is historical circumstance, and that time and place are really the motivating cause for what are ultimately just rhetorical differences or differences of rhetorical strategy. And I'm not sure that that's the, I don't know, I don't agree with that. And in part, I don't agree with it because I think that, like Strauss enjoins us to pay serious attention to the surface of things. And I think that for the ancients, at least, there are reasons that go beyond time and place that account for why the surface is the way it is. It's not simply a function of meeting historical particularity, that they want the reader or the hearer to approach certain questions in a certain way, or that there's something necessitating about the pedagogical process that structures the surface of things or structures the rhetorical overture to the city. And that's not simply mutable. Anyway, that's one thing. I would also say that with respect to Bacon, I think Bacon really does think that he's discovering something new over and above, let's say, Aristotelian metaphysics. I wish Zarco would have given his paper on dialectic, because he says some useful things there. but maybe he can say something about this. But yeah, I really think that Bacon thinks that he's adding at least a new kind of information about patterns or patterned motion that lies beyond the apparent phenomena or the phenomenal genera. I'll just stop there.
The next question is actually for Professor Minkov. So, and it follows. Yeah, yes, Mr. Bissett, please.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow on what Paul said, I think Nietzsche, understands human beings in an evolutionary way, and he looks at and characterizes what Plato managed to do, in articulating the ideal of the theoretical man, that is Socrates. And he characterizes in Birth of Tragedy as the successful solution to the Greek, crisis of their time, that it was successful for 2,000 years. And he speaks in Twilight of the Idols of how, Platonism's transformation into Platonism for the people, that is into Christianity, prepares the way for the next step in our psychic evolution, the spiritualization of the passions. He says that could have never been done on the ground that Platonism was planted on, right? So there's a transformation that takes place over time through the promulgation of the moralities that end up being articulated as a result of these philosophies, which kind of circles in a certain way. I think, Paul, you said the eugenic effects of New Atlantis. There's a transformation of human nature and of the contemporary circumstance, and you can't just simply, say that they each would have agreed, going across the time.
Arthur, very quickly, but for Machiavelli, to get back to an earlier point, he really did think that there was a fundamental change in historical circumstance that the ancients hadn't contemplated, not through any fault of their own. It literally happened after they wrote, and by the time, so that is to say, the Roman conquest of the ancient world, the emergence of Christianity, the confrontation with revealed religions, to name the three most important. And this happens long after the ancient doctrine is more or less settled. And by the time the confrontation is taken up by serious thinkers, it's not clear that Machiavelli was all that. I mean, he certainly knew the Bible well, extremely well. It's not at all clear that he knew Maimonides or any of the Jewish medievals, but he certainly knew the Islamic medievals, and he knew Aquinas, and he knew the scholastics, and he knew the humanists. And his view was all of those quasi-philosophic, or philosophic if you want, attempts to address this problem have failed in a new way. And on specifically Aristotelian Platonic grounds, they failed. And perhaps through no fault of their own, they're not breaking free enough. They're not being radical enough because they haven't adequately confronted the nature, the bigness, the largeness of the historical change. And so he says, I'm going to have to do it because everything that attempted to do it before me didn't go far enough.
Thank you. We're short on time. Maybe this will be our last question. This is a follow-up from a previous discussion we had a moment ago. Professor Minkov, you said several times that Bacon admits there are forms, but they are not the forms that you said we expect, or you said originally strike the eyes.
Yeah.
Can you say more about this difference between the forms and the forms we expect? Please use some concrete examples.
I hope that's not you, Arthur, saying it, because it's a very impolite question.
It's somebody that wants to pin you down.
Right. So the true differences, that's what Democritus is after too. Yeah, I mean, I think I used too concrete of an example earlier about male and female. I'm not sure the questioner heard that or not. Maybe it was after I had mentioned that. That I think maybe too much. I mean, Aristotle thinks male and female is a kind of matter-form distinction, so it is fundamental. Perhaps it doesn't apply to human beings and with the same kind of fundamentalness. Right. So Democritus is looking for the genuine differences. Of course, he's not doesn't say everything is one, but there are real differences. And it's not Greek versus Jew or something like that, but it's a different kind of difference. So let's see. Yeah. So I think basically the hope is that the hope that Bacon holds out there is that hard, which I don't think he believes, but it would be very difficult to show, that hard, soft, long, short, etc. Distinctions will explicate the conflict in the Middle East, because there's a deeper. These people look so similar, but in fact they're fighting. So the way you explain it, there's a deeper kind of pre-Socratic materialist explanation of why they're fighting, and there's no rejection of nature. It's just a wrong-headed explanation. The Plato and Aristotle ran with too superficial an impression of what the fundamental differences are. So I don't know. I mean, I'm giving too many concrete examples without really giving the right examples. But that's yeah. So you take any kind of thing you care about, and there's a deeper reasoning. So one simple thing will be, oh, you think you're depressed and sad about not fulfilling something. No, it's just hormonal changes. That'll be something that Bacon is pointing to. But I don't think, the problem is that I don't think Bacon really thinks that. But yeah, but that'll be a concrete example. Would be that what the difference between sadness and happiness is not fulfillment or lack of fulfillment, but something like quantitative changes which belong to physics. Actually, there is one really amazing thing about physics, which I didn't. I mean, it's just startling when you read Advancement of Learning, that the physics is super short, and then it comes up again and again as an explanation of something. Metaphysics, poetry. So it's everywhere. So I think he does mean that the physical differences. I wish I had it right away, but there's certain physical differences that are so important. Diversity, for example, he says, that one wonders whether metaphysics exists at all. He says that having assigned so much to physics and having constrained natural theology within its bounds, is there any room for metaphysics?
Okay, thank you. Last question, Professor Deduc, your presentation of Bacon sounds very plausible. Why do you think students of Strauss, more often than not, claim he, Bacon, is in favor of a full-throated conquest of nature?
I don't know what the questioner means by full-throated conquest of nature. I mean, I think that
I think that the possibilities of manipulations of matter are limitless. And that, this questioner thinks, is sort of the position that many Straussians claim is Bacon's, but you are presenting a much more moderate Bacon.
no, I don't want to dispute the idea that Bacon thinks that an essentially technical science is limitless. My presentation had to do with his agreement with the ancients that the political support or patronage of a technological science had to be safely undertaken under certain constraints or limits, but that in principle, the conquest of nature, I think this is in some sense why Bacon thinks this approach to science is so attractive, because there doesn't seem to be a ceiling or limit on its possibility. I'm sorry if I misled the listeners, but no, I think that that if you look at the things that he says about the conquest of nature, or the sort of list of the technological yield in New Atlantis, I mean, it's sort of like sky's the limit. I wish I could ask the questioner to clarify. Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much for your presentations, for the time that you put into thinking this through. Thank you very much for the people that have joined us. Nice seeing everybody. Everybody stay tuned. In the coming days, we will send out another invite like this that will be, as I mentioned before, the reverse. It will be the ancients' critique of the moderns. So please join us for that. Thank you very much, everyone.